Okay, you should have something like this already. If you don't, make sure you go back, watch the first video, and get your data in this form. Of course, you shouldn't have the exact same as me. Your random selection would give you different countries. Maybe you chose a different variable, but something like this. So you're going to go to Add-ons, and then if you have Excel Miner Analysis Toolpack, you can just go ahead and start it. If not, go to Get Add-ons, and then you'll do a search for Excel Miner, and you'll click on it, and uh, you should have a button that says something like install or get. I already have it, so my option is to uninstall. Once you have that, then you'll go here, you should see it show up, and you'll click start. This gives you access to a wide array of statistical tests. What we're going to run is a 2-sample test, and we are going to had to make sure we are going to assume unequal variances. Basically, if you do the equal variances and you're wrong, your results will be off. If you do your unequal variances and they turn out to actually be equal, you're just losing a little bit of power, but your results are still accurate. So variable one range, what we want to do is we want this variable here. So we're not using the prosperity rank. We're definitely not using the name of the country. And I'm going to put in the prosperous countries here. So I'm selecting it and then clicking in that box. And then I'm going to do the same here for the less prosperous, not getting the NAs. Make sure you don't get those. And then click in that variable 2 range. You should put 0 here. Our null hypothesis is that there is no difference in the ecological footprint or whatever you're measuring between the prosperous countries and the less prosperous countries. Typically when you run this test, you'll just have a 0 there. We do not have labels, or at least I did not. Notice when I selected the data, I only selected numbers. If you somehow arranged your sheet so that each time you selected something, it did include a column header, you could click labels. But if you only selected the data for these variable ranges like I did, then this should not be clicked. Alpha, we're going to do it at a 0.05, and then output range, you can click wherever you want it first. Just click anywhere to the right of your data, maybe E2, and then click in that output range. And voila, that's your test. So how do we interpret this? So to remind you what we did here, the first basic step of a hypothesis test is to figure out what your hypotheses are. Basically, you've got 2 possibilities. The first is what's called the null hypothesis, or the nothing hypothesis. In this case, it would mean that there's no difference in average ecological footprint between the wealthy or the prosperous countries and the less prosperous countries. The alternative is that there is a difference in this ecological footprint. Now, we could put that in a direction. We could say that our alternative is that this is higher than these, or that this is lower than these. For this assignment, I'm having you do what's called a two-tailed, which means we're not going to assume we know which direction. If there is a difference, it might be that the prosperous countries are having a heavier footprint, or that the less prosperous countries are. So we're doing what's called a two-tailed test. And then we go in and actually look and see what the data says about that. So we have our sample means. This is how many average Earths my sample of prosperous countries are, the heaviness of their footprint. So it would require 5.5 Earths long term if these countries, if the entire globe used resources at the rate that these countries were doing. Much lesser for the less prosperous. But we can't quite tell just from this. We can't tell just by looking at the sample means whether or not there's a difference. That's the whole point of hypothesis testing. We have to see if the difference between them is strong enough that it's not because of just the random sample we chose happened to be really bad on the environment here and really easy on the environment here. So that's why we go down and check further. The big thing I want to draw your attention to, we have two p-values here. We are going to use the two-tail because our research question was two-tail. We didn't presume to know which set of countries might have the heavier ecological footprint. We kind of went into it open-ended. So I'm going to highlight this. This is the key value I'm looking at here. And this number gives me an answer to the question, is there a difference in average ecological footprint between the prosperous countries and the non-prosperous countries? The lower this number is, this p-value is, the more evidence there is that there is a difference. In other words, it's evidence against that null hypothesis, that idea of there being no difference. The lower the p-value is, the more evidence against the null. In fact, we make a decision to reject the null typically if this p-value is below our alpha. Remember, our alpha level is 0.05. So if this number right here is lower than 0.05, we're going to reject the null. In other words, the evidence against it is so strong that we say it's not likely we would have got results like this if the null were true, so we're going to reject it. An easy way to remember that is p-value low, null must go, must get rejected. So what happens when we reject the null, which in my case, for this particular sample, I did reject the null? Well, that means that the alternative hypothesis is what we're going to say the data suggests. In this case, the alternative hypothesis was there is a difference between the two groups of countries in average ecological footprint. And specifically, by looking at the sample means, I can tell that this prosperous group of countries had a heavier impact. So what this p-value tells me is I'm going to conclude that the wealthier countries, or the more prosperous countries across the earth, not just these 12 countries, but in general, the more prosperous countries do have a heavier ecological footprint than the less prosperous ones. Now, a very important follow-up question that we're going to talk more about later in the course is how much of a difference is there? So we've seen, I mean, this is way below 0.05, this p-value. That doesn't mean that there's a huge difference. This p-value is just answering the question, how certain are we? Is there a difference, that there is a difference? Then we'd have to do a separate look at something called an effect size to find the practical significance, or how much of a difference is there? And that's a very important, I mean, is it that the wealthy countries are just doing a little more use of the Earth's resources than the less prosperous, or is it by a huge amount? And judging by the sample means, I'm going to guess that it is a fairly large amount, but that's where we would bring in an effect size, and we're not going to talk about that right now. The final thing you would do here, and by the way, there are 3 comments. Make sure you read the Moodle instructions. You need to tell me which of these countries is which. In my case, this was the prosperous, and less prosperous countries. Depending on how you selected your data, these could be flipped, so do make sure you're taking a peek. Now, I could select these numbers and look down in my overall. I see that this is 5.566, so that matches with the average here. That could be a double check for you if you wanted to tell you which set of countries is which. If it doesn't match, then that tells you you probably didn't select them all, or maybe you checked labels even though you didn't select labels or something. But this average should match this number, and the average of these numbers should match that number. Then your second comment, of course, is on this p-value telling me if you would reject or not, and what that means in plain English for your data. And then the third thing that you want to do is tell me, based on your own life, what that, how this sits with you. And for me personally, Even though I have been in a lot of countries that were less prosperous and there were a lot of fumes in the street, I also know that the industry is much, much heavier in the just daily use, the energy use that our family uses or my friends' families use is much, much heavier than when I lived in India and we just had a tiny little cooking fire. There was no electricity. We basically used very little, if any, had very little, if any, footprint on the Earth. So it does match up with what I had seen. But I want to hear how, and it's fine if it doesn't match with what your observations have been.